Hello friends, today I am doing a long overdue wrap up because I've been reading a lot of books lately. I feel like I've been zooming through them really only the past 2 weeks because earlier this year, and I mentioned this a couple videos back, I felt like I was moving through mud, just slowly trudging through these books, partly because life is crazy, a lot of work, family, raising a young infant, all that, and plus reading these chunker books just will slow you down. And although I'm loving the books and I'm happy and grateful that I have time to read, sometimes the books can just feel like a slog, especially when you are just nibbling at a 1,000-page book piece by piece. And so it's nice to have short stories and novellas and variety basically in your reading diet. So with that said, I'm going to be briefly discussing my thoughts on all these books. I might ramble a little bit, I might rant a little bit depending on the book. We'll see. The first book I want to talk about is probably the longest. Actually, it's not the longest because I read Les Miserables with my book club earlier this year. But the second longest book, just over 1,000 pages, Stalingrad by Vasily Grossman. Now, many of you will remember Life and Fate, favorite book I read last year. And Life and Fate is largely his most popular novel. Stalingrad is generally a prequel. Now, someone was getting nitpicky with me in the comments in the last video when I said it was a prequel. It's basically a prequel. The events within Stalingrad largely lead up to the events in Life and Fate. There's a little bit of overlap, and actually there's a lot of interesting history about how this novel was put together, the different editions that came out, censored and revised, and all sorts of things that that the translator Robert Chandler gets into within the afterword of this novel. But all that out of the way, this novel was phenomenal. However, the way that this novel succeeds, what makes this novel great, is very different, honestly, than what makes Life and Fate great. Now, granted, they both have a similar style, as you would imagine, coming from the same author, having overlapping characters and even events to some extent. However, this carries far more of the mark of socialist realism, where it is very centered around the ideals of socialism, and not in the sense that it reads like propaganda, like it reads like Grossman was specifically trying to curry favor with the party or avoid persecution or anything like that. In fact, he butted heads a lot with the censors and authority figures at the time when trying to publish this novel, hence why it is published as "За правое дело" or "For a Just Cause" in the Russian, rather than Stalingrad, which was the original intended title and which was restored by Robert Chandler in his English translation. But to get back to my point, it carries those socialist ideals. It's very much rooted in this idea that the Soviet Union, not just in a political sense or in the state, but really the Russian people, the Soviet people, are standing up as this collective will and this collective humanitarian force against the sheer evil and monstrous forces of fascism and of Nazi Germany. It carries this collectiveness, whereas I think Life and Fate is far more a novel of individuals. Now, there are still those elements explored of fascism versus socialism, those kind of dualities, but also the kind of common thread within them of authoritarianism and that moral grayness. There's far less moral grayness in this novel. And now you can still look at certain sections, look at certain scenes and characters and find bits of those themes in this novel. But to me, this is a novel of collectivism not just in the sense of the political ideology or socialism overall, but in terms of human will, this collective human will and its ability to not just resist fascism and evil in the times of World War II and against and resisting Hitler's Nazi Germany, but in many ways I feel like the novel really captures human perseverance, sacrifice, and most of all, the gestalt of humanity and how it's able to withstand these cyclical forces of evil that rise up throughout history. And I go into detail, far more detail about that idea and why I kind of view it in terms of that within this novel, how this novel bleeds into Life and Fate, how they work synergistically, how they work differently in my essay on Substack. I'm not going to be able to be as articulate and really concise in this video here. I'll end up rambling. So I will refer you to my own essay there But what a phenomenal novel. Now, the question that I get asked a lot that will enrage a particular person that constantly comments on my videos, I appreciate it though, is which should you read? I think most of you should read Life and Fate first. Now, why? Why, if this book is technically a prequel or in some sense leading up to the events of Life and Fate, why should you skip over this? Well, the first reason is because this is a big investment for any reader. This is just nearly 2,000 pages, and if you aren't fully sure that you want to read both novels, go ahead and dig into, in my opinion, the slightly better novel and the one that's going to kind of convince you basically to go back and read the prequel. The second reason I think that that's the case is because this is just a better novel. It explores and intertwines history, philosophy, ethical or just morality and ethics, and as well as the narrative is honestly more compelling in this book than in Stalingrad. Stalingrad is a little bit more long-winded, and it's not it still contains these vivid depictions. It still goes on these digressions that are insightful and just profound. But Life and Fate is just better at that. It's just a better novel at that, and it's a smidge more concise at like roughly a little bit over 800 pages. So I think it's the better novel as well. And the last reason is, personally, I read them out of order and lost nothing. I lost nothing reading them out of order. Nothing felt spoiled to me. Obviously, these events do lead into, so you kind of have a little bit of foresight, especially if you read them in close succession, and your memory is still there. But I didn't feel any less enthralled with Stalingrad because I read Life and Fate first. That's my opinion. Robert Chandler, the translator of both of these, himself suggested that although both novels were kind of intended to be kind of one singular volume or one singular novel, but they can be read separately. He suggested as much in the introduction to Life and Fate, and I agree with him. I think they can be read separately specifically because they carry different tones. They have a different kind of coloring to them. However, despite the fact that they have a lot of, obviously they're overlapping in more ways than not. So that's my last 2, 3, 5 cents on both of these novels. Phenomenal. I can't recommend them enough. I think Grossman is quite possibly the most unsung hero or unsung Russian novelist of the 20th century. And I stand by that. I plan on reading more of his works later. So yeah, those are my thoughts on those novels. Next up, a couple shorties real quick. A School for Fools, Shkola для Durakov by Sasha Sokolov. This novel is one of the strangest novels I've ever read, primarily because of the narrative style. So going in, I knew that Sokolov writes in a very unconventional style. He's actually written a handful of novels. I think in the 80s, he kind of got sick of publishing or the industry or whatever was going on and decided to stop writing for the public. I think he still writes, but he just doesn't publish anything. And this novel itself was censored and had to be published. I think it was first published actually in the US. And then it got promoted by Nabokov, who gave it a nice blurb on here, as well as, and then it eventually got translated and published elsewhere. But going in, I knew that this was going to be a weird book because Sokolov is known for just being very difficult, if not impossible, to translate into English. And I understand why after reading it. So the narrative follows this mentally ill student who is basically schizophrenic. He really has this dual or this split personality because the narrative is essentially told through this split narrative. So you have two unreliable narrators who are not only telling you this story, but at times are bickering with each other, are disputing each other's claims, or questioning whether, was it really this or was it that? And that's what makes this book kind of weird, because it reads, it doesn't read in a way that you can't follow, but at times it kind of steps outside of the bounds of time, because they'll be discussing, I say they, as if it's the same person, but the narrator is discussing his favorite teacher, Pavel Petrovich, who he also calls Saul. So there's a lot of biblical references into, which I'll get in a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself here. And he'll mention, oh, Pavel did this today, or was it yesterday, or is he going to do it in the future? So there's this kind of mixing up of when things occur. He's in love with this other teacher, Veta, and so she pops up here and there, and it's kind of broken into 3 larger sections as well. And especially the middle section is such a fusion of memories, of potential dreams, is this imagination? And so for that, it's a weird book. I don't think most of you would like this. That's not a like a non-recommendation. What would you call it? Like a warning? It is a warning. It's a warning with this book. I think some of you would like it. I think most of you would probably not. And even myself, I'm a little bit mixed about it. Like, as soon as I finished it, I was like, I didn't love it, but I thought, some elements of it were inventive, were creative, But for me, the biggest challenge was, as much as I'm deeply entrenched in Russian culture and I'm studying the language and I understand, large bits of the history and all of that, even then, I was at a loss for some of these references, some of the allusions made, also because a lot of them are biblical allusions. But it's a weird book. It's a weird book. That's kind of all I have to say about it. The last note I'll add is that the translator provides a lot of notes in the back, and I think that they were very helpful and shows that his translation is probably the best you can do with it. And I think that, the choices he made were quite intelligent and smart choices. Next up, we'll see what I have to say about these. Ezra Pound's selected cantos. So I gave this about 20 minutes. I gave it 20 minutes, and I'll explain why. Pound is someone that I've been curious about. I've not felt like this strong pull to read him, but I've heard about him. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about him, and a lot of people hold him in high esteem. And I'm not here to crap on him. I'm not here to praise him either. All I'm going to say is I tried to read the first few cantos, and I immediately realized this wasn't for me. To me, it was, do I DNF now or do I DNF tomorrow? Because if I don't give up now, it's a matter of time. Not simply because they're challenging structurally and they're just... Pound is just, from what I know, known for being inscrutable, but also because whether it's the use of different languages in the back with no kind of footnotes or endnotes for translating, which again, it's fine, but like that's just a lot more work for me to jump in and translate the Italian or the Chinese or whatever. But also, just to be honest, I haven't read a lot of the ancient Greeks, and so some of these references and allusions to either the epics or the plays and things like that, they're just going right over my head, and it's just not for me. So I called it quits pretty early. I will be selling that or donating it sometime soon because I will not be returning to it. Now, another book that slightly disappointed me is Ada by Mark Haber. So this book will be coming out next month. I think I mentioned it in my last video. And it's a very slim 90 pages. I think I read it in a day, maybe a day and a half. And I shouldn't be surprised. I shouldn't be surprised because it does still carry Haber's narrative and writing style. It is quirky. It does have humor. It is kind of strange. It is more than anything this continuous stream of consciousness that kind of sucks you in. However, in this narrative, I found the narrative to be stuffy, to be a little bit suffocating and aimless at times. So the story follows this French tyrannical prodigy, we could say. And he's the son of a rebellious nationalist who's been exiled from France, and now he's in these kind of swampish lands in the outskirts, and kind of towards the some German mountains, I believe. And he's pacing this great room, and that's essentially the entire story. He's pacing the great room, but the story takes place in his mind. It takes place in his reflections and digressions, his memories of his beloved Ada, who he had a one-night stand with back in Paris. And the story kind of goes on from there. It's not without moments of charm, humor, or intrigue. There is that, but for me, the narrative just kind of went nowhere. And I can handle that. There's plenty of books I've read that the actual plot or the action is stagnant the entire time, and simply the prose is what makes the novel come alive. I love books like that. This just didn't come alive for me. And in fact, I thought that some of the ways he was setting up this sort of, maniacal and egotistical narrator who is obsessed with this Ada, and then he's kind of reflecting on his grandfather, who his grandfather was, very much bookish and appreciated knowledge, where his other descendants were fixated on the ways that we can use knowledge or technology purely for destruction. And there were these ideas there were seeds planted, but they just never sprouted. And I thought that honestly, if you leveraged this, because a lot of the novel is pending on who is coming, who is arriving. Is it Ada and her new husband? Is it potentially the Romans? Is it a Habsburg inspector general? So there's this tension in the air of who's going to arrive while he's pacing the great room. And I actually thought that if we carried the ending that is contained in this book a little bit further, or we maybe introduced the supposed duel that the narrator was expecting with the husband or fiance of his beloved, it might actually raise some of these ideas that Haber was, starting to kind of plant and develop. It just felt a little bit cut short. That's just my take on it. Some people have already been loving the novel, but yeah, those are my thoughts on it thus far. All right, now for some of the big boys. The Tunnel by William H. Gass. Now I'm going to be brief because I've already both spoken at length about this. I've written at length about this in the book club, because every week I'm writing these extremely long, maybe too long, analysis and commentary as we were working through the book. But does this say enough? All these tabs in here. And I'm not one to just tab everything. This was a phenomenal book. It's honestly, it exceeds the ability to kind of summarize it, because on the surface you have a professor of a Midwestern university, a history professor, German history, who is building this tunnel underneath his house. But the tunnel is not simply physical, it is also symbolic. And as you read the novel further, especially when you compound it with some of what Gass has said about the book, especially his interview with Michael Silverblatt, you start to notice how the tunnel is just almost a bottomless symbol. It becomes multi-tiered. It becomes superimposed, where events within the memory of the character, the mental spiraling of the narrator, as well as the physical tunnel he's digging, and the moments that are happening, the events that are happening in his life in the present. All of these things are interwoven. They are infinitely reflecting on, I guess not infinitely, but they're reflecting on each other. And it's just so fascinating the way that Gass's writing is unlike most writers you will stumble upon, because it's so rich in meaning. It balances at times this juvenile-ish or, comedic. I mean, there's so many moments in this book that I was just cracking up. It's humorous, it's vulgar at times, it's again childish, and then at other times it's poetic, it's brilliant, it's breathtaking. It reads like it. The rhythm just pulls you in like waves in an ocean. Just it's marvelous. And on top of that, the book itself, not just in title, but in form, is a tunnel that is slowly narrowing, that is slowly kind of cinching you down this certain path. And that's all that, not to go into the details of the book or into its digressions on history and the different perspectives towards historical analysis and the weaknesses and fallacies that exist within it. Oh, there's so much. There's so much of this book I will certainly be rereading in the future, and probably over and over. Very much looking forward to having our live chat at the end of this month, talking about this book in the club. It's been a joy to read, and well worth the hype, well worth the wait. That said, a lot of you might dislike it. But moving on, history book, Exit Stalin by Mark B. Smith. My review just went live of this on Open Letters Review, so you can check that out for something short, concise. But I really enjoyed this. This is covering the decades, basically the final 40-ish years of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. He dies in 1953, the collapse occurs in 1991, And in between that, a lot happens. But it's not as clear cut. I think, especially in the West, we view the Soviet Union as this house of cards. We viewed it as this house of cards that was inevitably going to collapse. But the reality of the situation is a lot more complex, and that's exactly what Smith does in this book, because he looks at the society, the civilization, rather than purely the political state. And he looks at how these different dimensions, he looks at 6 specific dimensions. Some of them that come to mind will be, of course, economics, political, but also he's looking at kind of social, he's looking at labor, and these different ways that the policies had this trickle-down effect. For example, if you look at perestroika and the ways that Gorbachev tried to kind of kickstart, or, as the name would suggest, perestroika, rebuild. He tried to rebuild some things and adapt this hybrid system between capitalism and socialism. And the way that he disrupted the laws and opened these different paths for small businesses or freelancers or private, again, business opportunities, and also how it changed people's relationship to work, to the state, to finances, all of that. Just that one kind of policy had massive consequences, but that's late stage stuff. If we're looking at the thaw, which Khrushchev introduced in this de-Stalinization process that really reshaped, reshaped the Soviet Union, but also challenged a lot of the past and opened up a lot of room for disagreement, room for criticism, for looking at these open wounds that still existed after Stalin's, years of purges and World War II and repressions and the Gulag and all of that. But then below, as this thaw, as the name would kind of suggest, it comes from a title of a novel published around the time. But even after you melt those initial layers of control and censorship and this looming threat that was cast over society, you give people a little bit of space to breathe. Even below that are further icy layers of bureaucracy, the police state, all of that. And so this, to me, it succeeds as a very great overview and framework for thinking about the Soviet Union, these different phases that it went through. He utilizes these kind of mini biographies, these little snapshots into different figures, whether it's Yuri Gagarin or Lyudmila Ulitskaya or Alexander Solzhenitsyn. All these different figures, he uses them as to kind of give you a individual or singular experience of how some of these policies or these cultural shifts, these artistic movements are influencing, let's say, through the lens of an individual, but also looking at the kind of macro view as well. To me, it's a good overview of the period, but it is lacking in terms of a thorough look at the certain policies, the decisions, the bureaucracy, all of that, which inevitably is going to be hard to fit into roughly like 500 pages. But if you're looking for an overall view of that time period, I think it's a good place to start. Now, before I get to the last couple short books that I read here in English, I did read 2 short stories in the original in Russian. I was very proud about that. Of course, it wasn't perfect. I was leveraging the translation on Kindle for a lot of the words that I'm not familiar with, the higher level stuff, the literary vocabulary, all of that. But I reread The Fate of Man, Судьба человека by Mikhail Sholokhov, of course, the author of And Quiet Flows the Dawn. It's a very phenomenal, tragic, touching short story. I recommend it to everybody. I think you can even find a free version in English online if you look hard enough. But a great short story. It follows the narrator stumbles upon this man with presumably his child, but it's a young boy. And basically from there, this older man tells his story. And it's a story that is all too familiar for men and women, but especially men within the Soviet Union at the time, which is, you're raised up, maybe you lived through the October Revolution, maybe you were born already into the Soviet Union, and you build a life for yourself. You get a job, you do the right thing, you have a wife, you have these beautiful children, and then all of a sudden your country goes to war, and you get a draft notice, and you head off to war. and you're either murdered, you die pretty quickly in the war, or maybe you end up getting captured and you are barely surviving, being tortured, tormented in a prison camp. And then maybe you die there, but maybe you make your way back. Maybe you survive all the horror of witnessing, again, all the horrors of war and all that you've seen around you. You make it back. You haven't seen your family in years, and come to find out, well, you know what? I'm going to spoil the story if I continue. But basically, it's a story that is all too familiar, and it's a story that captures the lives of millions. And for that reason, I think it's still taught in schools today in Russia, and I understand why. It's very heavy. It's very touching. At moments, it really gives you chills. I highly recommend it. And reading it in the Russian was a cool experience as well. Of course, I was reading it a lot slower, but it was neat to kind of start to make that progress a little bit, and definitely motivates me to continue. Another story I read was Yushka by Andrei Platonov, who many of you will recognize from The Foundation Pit, but a lot of his books, Chevengur, I think, is another novel that he's had translated. A lot of his novels have been translated by New York Review of Books. They're published there. So a lot of you will be familiar with Platonov. And this is one of his short stories, and it's never been translated in English, or maybe it's in some older collection. Maybe you can find it somewhere. But I read it in the Russian. It's very short, just like maybe 9 or 10 pages, something like that. But it follows a worker, a metal worker, in a factory, and he's basically treated horribly by all those around him. He sticks to himself. He works. He's first up at work. He heads home. He saves his money. He doesn't spend it on anything. And everyone kind of treats him like he's an idiot, or like he's just a loser. The kids throw rocks at him. They belittle him. They call him names, all of that. But every year he heads off into the forest, heads towards Moscow, if I remember correctly, and then returns and carries this out. And he does this for years, and no one really knows why. Eventually he's sick and he passes away. But this girl all of a sudden shows up. This younger woman shows up, maybe I guess like teen years, something like that. So still a young woman, and she shows up and she's asking about him. Where's I forgot what his real name is, but the factory worker quickly puts 2 and 2 together and says, "Oh, you mean Yushka, da, Yuri, yeah." Unfortunately, he passed away. And come to find out, Yushka has been saving up his money all the time, or all these years, to pay for this orphan girl and give her a really great education, food, shelter, clothing, all of that. And the big message of the story, in a lot of ways, is despite these people belittling him, treating him horribly, he tells I don't remember if it's a friend or if it's another worker. These people, they don't realize it, but I'm a vessel for them to air out their grievances. Without me, they don't have a place to kind of let out their anger or their depression, their frustration. Like he is basically taking on the burden, taking on these sins. And in a way, he's like a Christ-like figure. He's taking on the burden to alleviate for others. And it really is kind of, again, wrapped up in this socialist idea of it's more about others. It's more about the collective and for the greater good rather than oneself. And the daughter, or not the daughter, she's basically treated like a daughter. This girl, this orphan girl he's been taking care of and putting all of his energy and money into, she ends up returning to the village. And as a doctor, because she's received this great education and had it paid for, she starts taking care of all the villagers who start to fall sick and need help and assistance. So in a way, Yushka, even after his death, is still taking care of the village, proxy, via this girl that he was taking care of. So it's a very charming story. I really enjoyed it. For maybe the handful of you that can read Russian or native Russian speakers, highly recommend it. And for those of you that are in English, hopefully it is translated at some point, because I think it's a great short story. So I enjoyed that. But now let me share with you quick takes on some of these stories. So Junichiro Takazaki, that would be the best I can pronounce it, The Siren's Lament. So this is 3 short stories in this little edition from Pushkin Press. I didn't love all of them. The first story is very much like a parable, and so is the last story. The first one has far more like Chinese mythology mixed into it, as well as the influence of Confucius. And And so it just didn't quite click. It didn't really stand out to me. The middle story, Killing Atusia, that was very fascinating. I very much did not know where the story was going, so it had this kind of thrilling aspect to it. You're following this younger man who falls in love with the daughter of the shop he works at, this pawn store, and she eventually convinces him, like, well, we should run off together. And they follow them on this kind of windy adventure. They lose track of each other. He eventually finds her again, and through all this, he's kind of losing himself. He's committing murders, and he's, basically willing to risk it all or give it up, give everything for this ideal. But more than the ideal, he's just willing to kind of be seduced by this girl, this fantasy, and just be deceived. And there's more to the story. There's definitely more to the story, but just to be brief there, I enjoyed that. The other story is not as much, but I'm not done with Tanizaki. I think I'll give him more of a chance because the prose in the last story was pretty beautiful, although the story itself, the narrative, was maybe a little bit more bland. Moscow, to the end of the line, Moskva, Petushki. This was a hilarious book, but really, it's dark humor, both humorously dark, but it's also dark in theme. It's a disturbing book that follows this drunken narrator who is boarding a train from Moscow, as you would imagine, to Petushki. He's heading eastward, and he's going through each station, so there's no chapter breaks, but you are kind of hinted at, okay, they're passing this station, that station, and along the way, he's basically oscillating between these drunken, vulgar, and perverse, and sometimes, furious rants about society, communism, the party, all sorts of things. But then on the other hand, he'll go on these just brilliant digressions about, with biting satire about social, political issues, or about alcoholism and things like that. And that's actually what the kind of core of the book is centered around, is alcoholism, because the book was written, or it was initially published in like the 70s. It faced censorship, so I think it was technically fully published in 89 in the Soviet Union, but was written and published through Samizdat in the 70s. And this was at like a large spike, a height of alcoholism, which the Soviet Union has experienced several spikes of this. But so it looks at those dark sides that were all too real. So that's the kind of troubling aspect of this novel. Is you hear these rants, you hear kind of the misfortune, the despair of these characters, and you have to kind of remember that like these are essentially real people. They're not entirely caricatures as much as they are reflections of the time. But of course things are exaggerated and turned up to some extent. But the narrative is just crazy. It's crazy. It's humorous. It's absurd. He's talking to the angels sometimes. He's talking to himself. He drifts off in a dream where he and some other comrades of his are sending postcards to neighboring countries trying to instigate a war because to save themselves from to basically trigger a war economy and like restart the economy, they need to get into war. And it's just a ridiculous book, but I really enjoyed it, and it's pretty short, so I think a lot of you would have fun with it. The next one, another very touching, sad story, Sofia Petrovna. This book basically follows the story that is similar to The Fate of Man, that is all too familiar within the Soviet Union, of people in the 1930s disappearing. It follows a woman, Sofia Petrovna, who's a typist, and she's raising her son. She's widowed. And she represents the every woman because in her life, everything starts to crumble come the late 30s, come the Great Purge and the terror of the Stalinist regime, which is her bosses and employees start to get arrested and accused. And her son eventually is accused. And his friend is accused. And her best friend is accused. And without spoiling things, everything just goes downhill, and it goes downhill very quickly. But the crux of the novel is that the ideal or the mentality that existed within the Soviet Union was that everything is done for a reason. In fact, the revolution itself was supposed to be this rise against injustice, and this Marxism is supposed to be objective and rational. And so even as all these arrests are happening, she's thinking to herself, well, if they're accused, like they're probably guilty, or if they got sent to a camp, they got sentenced, they must have been guilty. Oh, she looks at the crowds of women and says, all their husbands and sons, they're guilty. They're traitors, but not mine. Mine was a mistake. That clearly this was a switch up. And so by the end of the novel, you're realizing this overarching message that Chukovskaya is trying to paint here, which is that none of us are immune to authoritarianism. None of us are immune to fascism. None of us are immune to the danger that looms there, and that although it doesn't come for you today, it can easily come for you tomorrow. And so, yeah, a great book, a very short read as well. And then lastly is a book that practically none of you will want to read or like, and that is Time Forward. Время вперед. On the surface, this is the most boring narrative or like plot you could think of. It's a bunch of factory workers trying to break the record for how much cement mixes you can make in a single shift. Now, if that doesn't sound like the most boring plot that you can think of, give me another idea. But not only is it emblematic of socialist realism, is it reflecting of the times, but really two things stand out to me about this book, to make it brief here, is Valentin Kataev creates this very fascinating atmosphere that's almost cinematic, where everything is happening in motion. His way to convey this manipulation of time, the urgency of time and time, all this is fascinating. The characters are always rushing somewhere. They're always kind of, maybe they're talking on the go. People coming in and off the train. Everything is in motion. Even the depictions have this almost like blurred aspect to them. And so for that reason, it's just a very unique kind of sensation that I found intriguing. The other aspect that most of you will not appreciate, and that why you may or may not like the book, is the historical and contextual backdrop of this novel. So it's both historical and ideological. Historically, the book is taking place in Magnitogorsk, which is a factory or a city that was rapidly built up and became the epicenter of steel production within the Soviet Union. It was brought up basically from flat land, and a city was erected from it rapidly. And so like before they even had housing built, they had people in tents, heading and working there and laid out there. It was explored in depth, or not in depth, but I first came across this city in the Soviet Century by Grossman, who talks about it. And I definitely plan to do a deeper dive and write an essay about Magnitogorsk, the history of it, as well as this book. But so that's the kind of historical backdrop of this. But the idea of time and why it's such a crucial thing within this book and within the Soviet Union is because everything is about reaching socialism. Everything is about reaching this utopian society. That's at the center of Bolshevism, the center of Marxism, is getting everybody on board and working towards this utopia. And the faster they can produce cement, the faster they can produce this society, the faster they can propel society forward through science, through rationalism, through collective will, through collective ideals and all of that, the faster we can reach this heaven-like state, this utopia. And it's also a way, time is also a way for us to kind of manipulate or overcome nature. There's actually some great quotes in this book in a way that, socialism aside, you see that the ways that industrialization is an attempt for man to overcome what's possible. So in a lot of ways, the book is capturing the attempts for us to bring utopia forward, to overcome through machine, through human ingenuity and inventiveness and our daring spirit to overcome what is thought to be impossible. Because the workers are thinking, there's no way we can make 402 cement mixes. It's not humanly possible. But they find a way. They find a way to overcome that, to think past it, and bring about this prosperity and this flourishing in the future. So very, very interesting book. Again, a lot of you will not enjoy it, but just to be honest, but I did. So that's it. Those are all the books that I've been running through the past 2 months or so. And like I said, I have written about some of them, so I'll put those in the description down below. But let me know your thoughts. What have you been reading lately? Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe for more content, and I'll see you all in the next one.